When we talk about visceral fat, we are not talking about the fat you can pinch with your fingers. We are not talking about appearance, clothing size, or the number on a weighing scale. We are talking about a hidden metabolically active tissue that surrounds your internal organs, the liver, pancreas, intestines, and silently alters your health from the inside. This type of fat behaves very differently from subcutaneous fat, which lies just under the skin. Subcutaneous fat is relatively passive. Visceral fat is hormonally aggressive. Visceral fat is stored deep within the abdominal cavity. It wraps around vital organs and interferes with their normal function. Unlike superficial fat, which mainly acts as energy storage and insulation, visceral fat actively releases inflammatory chemicals, hormones, and signaling molecules that affect nearly every system in the body. It is biologically active, and that activity is what makes it dangerous. One of the major concerns with visceral fat is its relationship with insulin resistance. The more visceral fat accumulates, the more the body's cells become less responsive to insulin. This forces the pancreas to produce even more insulin to manage blood sugar levels. Over time, this cycle can lead to prediabetes and eventually type 2 diabetes. The danger is not cosmetic, it is metabolic. A person may appear only moderately overweight but still carry a significant amount of visceral fat and face serious metabolic consequences. Visceral fat is also strongly linked to cardiovascular disease. It contributes to higher levels of LDL cholesterol, lower levels of HDL cholesterol, and elevated triglycerides. More importantly, the inflammatory substances released by visceral fat damage blood vessels and promote plaque formation in arteries. This increases the risk of hypertension, heart attack, and stroke. The heart does not fail because of visible fat on the arms or thighs. It suffers because of what is happening deep inside the abdominal cavity. Another critical organ affected by visceral fat is the liver. Excess visceral fat increases the flow of free fatty acids directly into the liver through the portal. This overload contributes to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, NAFLD, a condition that is rapidly increasing worldwide. Fatty liver can progress silently for years before leading to inflammation, fibrosis, and even liver failure. Many individuals with fatty liver have no obvious symptoms, which makes visceral fat particularly deceptive. Hormonal balance is also disrupted by visceral fat. It alters cortisol regulation, influences estrogen and testosterone balance, and interferes with appetite hormones like leptin and ghrelin. This creates a vicious cycle. Increased visceral fat leads to hormonal imbalance, which in turn promotes further fat accumulation. The body becomes metabolically trapped, making weight loss increasingly difficult over time. What makes visceral fat especially concerning is that it does not always correlate perfectly with body weight. Two individuals with the same body mass index, BMI, may have very different levels of visceral fat. One may store more fat subcutaneously, while the other stores more internally. The second person may have a higher risk of metabolic disease despite appearing similar in size. This is why relying solely on weight as a health indicator can be misleading. Waist circumference is often a better predictor of visceral fat risk than overall. A growing abdominal circumference is frequently a sign of increasing internal fat accumulation. However, even this measurement is not perfect because visceral fat can accumulate before dramatic external changes become obvious. The inflammatory nature of visceral fat is central to its danger. Chronic low-grade inflammation driven by this fat tissue contributes not only to diabetes and heart disease, but also to certain cancers and cognitive decline. Research increasingly suggests that metabolic health and brain health are deeply connected. Excess visceral fat has been associated with an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative conditions. The reason visceral fat is so responsive to lifestyle interventions is also the reason it is so harmful. It is metabolically active. It reacts quickly to hormonal changes, particularly insulin and cortisol. When insulin remains high due to frequent eating, excessive refined carbohydrates, or chronic stress, visceral fat tends to accumulate. When insulin levels fall consistently through controlled nutrition and fasting strategies, visceral fat is often the first to decrease. Understanding visceral fat shifts the focus from cosmetic weight loss to metabolic correction. The goal is not simply to look leaner, but to reduce internal risk. You cannot see visceral fat in the mirror, but your organs feel its presence every day. That is why the conversation must move beyond aesthetics and toward internal health. If we are serious about burning visceral fat, we must first understand one fundamental principle. Fat burning does not begin simply because you stop eating. It begins when insulin falls to a level that allows your body to switch fuel sources. Without addressing insulin, fasting becomes a timer without a trigger. Insulin is a storage hormone. So, its primary job is to move glucose from the bloodstream into cells so it can be used for energy or stored for later. When you eat, especially carbohydrates, insulin rises. This is normal and necessary. However, while insulin is elevated, your body is in storage mode. In this state, fat burning is significantly reduced because insulin actively signals the body to store energy, not release it. The human body cannot efficiently burn fat and store fat at the same time. These are opposing metabolic states. When insulin is high, the body prioritizes glucose as its main fuel source and suppresses the breakdown of stored fat. Even if you consume fewer calories, persistently elevated insulin can limit access to fat stores. This is why simply reducing food quantity without improving hormonal balance often fails to reduce visceral fat effectively. After a meal, insulin remains elevated for several hours. The duration depends on the type of food consumed. Meals high in refined carbohydrates and sugars cause sharper and longer insulin spikes. Meals rich in protein also stimulate insulin, though in a more moderate way. Fat has the least direct effect on insulin. When meals are frequent throughout the day, breakfast, snacks, lunch, more snacks, dinner, insulin rarely returns to baseline. The body remains in a near constant storage state. For fat burning to begin meaningfully, insulin must drop low enough to activate hormone-sensitive lipase, an enzyme responsible for breaking down stored fat into fatty acids. When insulin is elevated, this enzyme is suppressed. When insulin falls, this enzyme becomes active. Only then can stored triglycerides in fat cells be broken down and released into the bloodstream to be used as fuel. This process does not happen instantly. It requires time without caloric intake. In the early hours after eating, the body primarily uses circulating glucose. After that, it turns to stored glycogen in the liver and muscles. Glycogen acts as a short-term energy reserve. As long as glycogen stores are available, the body prefers to use them. Only when glycogen levels decline significantly does the body increase its reliance on fat stores. This transition is tightly regulated by insulin levels. If insulin remains chronically elevated due to insulin resistance, the problem becomes more complex. In insulin resistance, cells do not respond properly to insulin, so the pancreas produces even more of it. This leads to higher baseline insulin levels throughout the day. In such individuals, even short fasting periods may not be sufficient to lower insulin enough to trigger effective fat burning. This explains why people with metabolic syndrome often struggle more with visceral fat. Stress further complicates the picture. Cortisol, the stress hormone, can indirectly increase insulin levels and promote fat storage, particularly in the abdominal area. Chronic stress keeps the body in a state of metabolic alertness, often increasing cravings for high carbohydrate food. These foods elevate insulin, reinforcing the storage cycle. Therefore, lowering insulin is not only about fasting duration, but also about food quality and stress regulation. It is important to clarify that insulin is not the enemy. It is essential for survival. The problem arises when insulin is persistently elevated without adequate periods of decline. The body was designed for cycles, periods of feeding and periods of fasting. Modern eating patterns disrupt this. Constant snacking and late-night meals prevent insulin from dropping to levels that allow metabolic switching. When insulin falls consistently, the body shifts from glucose dependence to fat adaptation. In this state, cells become more efficient at using fatty acids and ketones for energy. Visceral fat, being metabolically active, responds relatively quickly to this hormonal shift. But this shift cannot occur if insulin remains high. Many people focus only on calorie counting. While calorie balance does matter, hormonal control determines how those calories are stored or burned. Two diets with equal calories can produce different fat loss outcomes if one keeps insulin elevated and the other allows insulin to fall periodically. This is why meal timing and composition are as important as total intake. In practical terms, lowering insulin involves reducing refined carbohydrates, spacing meals appropriately, avoiding unnecessary snacking, and allowing structured fasting windows. Protein intake should be adequate but not excessive. Fiber-rich vegetables and healthy fats support satiety without causing sharp insulin spikes. Over time, consistent insulin control improves metabolic flexibility, the ability to shift between fuel sources efficiently. When insulin drops, the body gains access to stored energy. Fat cells release fatty acids. The liver begins producing ketones, and energy becomes stable rather than dependent on constant food intake. This is not starvation. It is metabolic efficiency. The body is simply switching from external fuel to internal reserve. Therefore, the key to burning visceral fat is not extreme deprivation. It is hormonal permission. And that permission begins the moment insulin falls low enough for the body to unlock its stored energy. Without that drop, fat remains stored. With it, the body finally begins the work of true metabolic repair. In the first 12 hours of fasting, the body is not primarily burning fat. This is a critical distinction that many people misunderstand. When someone skips a meal or fasts overnight, they often assume fat burning begins immediately. In reality, the body follows a structured and predictable metabolic sequence, and fat oxidation is not the first priority. Immediately after eating, the body is in what is known as the fat state. During this period, which lasts roughly 4 to 6 hours, depending on the size and composition of the meal, the body is focused on digesting, absorbing, and distributing nutrients. Glucose from carbohydrates enters the bloodstream, insulin rises, and cells begin using glucose as their main source of energy. Excess glucose is stored as glycogen in the liver and muscles. Any additional surplus may be converted into fat. Once digestion is largely complete and no new calories are entering the bloodstream, the body transitions into the post-absorptive state. However, even at this stage, the body does not immediately switch to burning fat as its dominant fuel source. Instead, it turns to glycogen, the stored form of carbohydrate. Glycogen serves as the body's short-term energy reserve. The liver stores approximately 80 to 100 grams of glycogen, while muscles collectively store several hundred grams. Though muscle glycogen is primarily reserved for muscular activity and not directly released into the bloodstream. Liver glycogen plays the key role in maintaining stable blood glucose levels during fasting. For approximately the first 8 to 12 hours without food, the body relies heavily on liver glycogen to maintain blood sugar stability. This is essential because certain tissues, especially the brain and red blood cells, require a continuous supply of glucose. The body prioritizes maintaining normal blood glucose over burning fat aggressively. Survival always comes before fat loss. During this glycogen-dependent period, insulin levels begin to decline gradually, but they may not yet be low enough to allow maximum fat breakdown. Glucagon, a hormone that opposes insulin, rises and signals the liver to release stored glycogen. As glycogen is broken down into glucose and released into the bloodstream, energy needs are met without requiring significant fat mobilization. This explains why short fasting periods, such as skipping breakfast or delaying lunch slightly, may not lead to substantial fat burn. The body still has a readily available energy supply in the form of glycogen. As long as glycogen stores are sufficient, the metabolic urgency to switch to fat as the primary fuel remains limited. It is important to understand that some fat burning does occur even in the early hours of fasting. The body is always using a mixture of fuels, glucose, fatty acids, and sometimes ketones, in varying proportions. However, during the first 12 hours, the dominant fuel source remains glucose derived from glycogen. The proportion of energy coming from fat gradually increases, but it does not yet dominate. Another factor influencing this timeline is the individual's metabolic condition. Someone who consumes high amounts of carbohydrates regularly may have larger glycogen stores and may take longer to deplete them. In contrast, someone following a lower carbohydrate diet may deplete glycogen faster and transition to fat burning sooner. Physical activity also accelerates glycogen depletion. A brisk walk, resistance training session, or other exercise during fasting can shorten the glycogen phase and hasten the metabolic shift. Hydration and stress levels also play subtle roles. Stress hormones such as cortisol can stimulate glucose production in the liver, which may delay the need to increase fat oxidation. Similarly, inadequate sleep can impair insulin sensitivity, affecting how efficiently the body transitions between fuel sources. By the 10 to 12-hour mark, glycogen stores are significantly reduced, though not always fully depleted. This is the metabolic crossroads. As glycogen continues to decline, insulin drops further, and hormone-sensitive lipase activity begins to rise. The body starts increasing lipolysis, the breakdown of stored fat into fatty acids. The liver begins preparing to produce ketones, especially if fasting continues beyond this point. Understanding this early fasting window is essential for realistic expectations. Many people expect dramatic fat loss from short fasting intervals, but physiologically the body is still completing its carbohydrate-dependent phase. The first 12 hours are preparation. They set the stage for fat burning, but they are not yet the peak fat burning period. This does not mean the first 12 hours are useless. On the contrary, they are necessary. They allow insulin to fall gradually, glycogen to decline safely, and the body to prepare for metabolic switch. Without completing this phase, the body cannot fully transition into efficient fat burning. Therefore, when discussing how long it takes to burn visceral fat, it is critical to recognize that the first 12 hours are primarily a glycogen burning phase. The body is clearing stored carbohydrates before accessing stored fat more aggressively. Only after this stage does fat oxidation accelerate meaningfully. Fat loss is not immediate, it follows biological order. The body always burns what is easiest first. In the early hours of fasting, that fuel is glycogen. Only when glycogen diminishes does the body unlock the deeper energy reserves stored as fat. After approximately 14 to 16 hours of fasting, the body begins to enter a distinctly different metabolic state. This is the point where significant fat burning becomes more consistent and meaningful, not because of willpower or calorie deprivation, but because the internal hormonal environment has changed. By this stage, several physiological processes align to favor fat as a primary fuel source rather than glucose. The most important change occurring during this window is the substantial reduction of insulin levels. Earlier in the fast, insulin declines gradually, but around the 14-16 hour mark, it often reaches a low and stable baseline. This matters because insulin is the primary hormone that inhibits fat breakdown. When insulin is low, hormone-sensitive lipase becomes more active, allowing stored triglycerides in fat cells to be broken down into free fatty acids. These fatty acids are then released into the bloodstream to be used for energy. At the same time, liver glycogen stores are largely depleted for most individuals. While the exact timing can vary depending on diet, activity level, and metabolic health, by this point, the liver no longer has abundant carbohydrate reserves to maintain blood glucose. The body is forced to adapt. To protect vital organs, especially the brain, it increases reliance on alternative fuel sources. This is when fat oxidation accelerates. The liver responds by converting fatty acids into ketone bodies, which can be used by the brain and other tissues for energy. This process, known as ketogenesis, becomes more pronounced as fasting continues beyond this window. While full nutritional ketosis may take longer, the metabolic shift toward fat-derived energy is clearly underway by 14 to 16 hours in many people. This period is especially relevant for visceral fat reduction. Visceral fat is more metabolically active than subcutaneous fat and is more sensitive to hormonal signals. When insulin remains low for several consecutive hours, visceral fat tends to release fatty acids more readily. This makes it one of the first fat depots to respond when the body transitions into a fat-burning state. Another important factor during this window is improved insulin sensitivity. As insulin levels stay low, insulin receptors on cells begin to reset and respond more effectively when insulin is later released during eating. This improves glucose handling and reduces the likelihood of excess energy being stored as fat. Over time, repeated exposure to this low insulin state can improve overall metabolic health. Growth hormone levels also rise during extended fasting. Growth hormone supports fat breakdown and helps preserve lean muscle mass. This is one reason why properly structured fasting does not necessarily lead to muscle loss, especially when adequate protein is consumed during eating periods. The hormonal environment during this stage favors fat mobilization while protecting essential tissues. Energy levels often stabilize during this phase. Many people report reduced hunger and more consistent mental clarity after crossing the 14-hour threshold. This is partly due to decreased blood sugar fluctuations and partly due to the brain adapting to the use of ketones as a supplementary fuel. Hunger hormones such as ghrelin tend to follow circadian patterns and may temporarily decrease once the body adapts to fasting. It is important to emphasize that this fat-burning state depends on consistency rather than a single long fast. Entering this metabolic window occasionally may provide short-term benefits, but sustained visceral fat reduction occurs when the body regularly experiences periods of low insulin and increased fat oxidation. This is why repeated fasting windows of similar duration are often more effective than sporadic extreme fasting. Individual variation plays a significant role. Someone with insulin resistance may take longer to reach this fat-burning state, while someone who is metabolically flexible may enter it sooner. Diet composition also influences the transition. Diets high in refined carbohydrates can delay insulin decline, while diets emphasizing whole foods, fiber, and healthy fats can facilitate a smoother shift. Physical activity can enhance this process. Light to moderate exercise during fasting increases fatty acid utilization and accelerates the transition into fat burning. However, excessive training combined with prolonged fasting may increase stress hormones, which can counteract some benefits. Balance remains essential. This stage of fasting is not about pushing the body to extremes. It represents a natural metabolic rhythm that humans evolved with, periods of feeding followed by periods of fasting. The modern challenge is not fasting too much, but fasting too little. Constant access to food keeps insulin elevated and prevents this metabolic switch from occurring. When the body reaches the 14-16-hour fasting window, it is no longer simply waiting for the next meal. It has adapted. It has shifted gears. It is actively using stored energy to sustain itself. This is where fat burning becomes efficient, hormonal signals align, and visceral fat begins to decrease in a meaningful way. Understanding this phase reframes fasting as a metabolic strategy rather than a test of endurance. The body is not being deprived, it is being allowed to function as designed. And in that state, fat loss becomes a biological outcome rather than a constant struggle. One of the most encouraging physiological truths about fat metabolism is that visceral fat is often the first type of fat to respond when hormonal conditions improve. This is not accidental. It is rooted in the biological nature of visceral fat itself. Unlike subcutaneous fat, which lies beneath the skin and tends to serve as long-term energy storage, visceral fat is highly metabolically active. It is constantly interacting with hormones, inflammatory signals, and the liver. Because of this high activity, it both accumulates quickly under poor metabolic conditions and reduces more readily when those conditions improve. Visceral fat cells have a higher density of certain hormone receptors, particularly those involved in fat breakdown. When insulin levels fall and hormones such as glucagon and adrenaline rise appropriately during fasting, visceral fat tends to release fatty acids into the bloodstream more readily than subcutaneous fat. In simple terms, visceral fat is more hormonally sensitive. That sensitivity works both ways. It grows quickly when insulin is high, and it shrinks relatively quickly when insulin remains low for sustained periods. Another important reason visceral fat responds early is its anatomical location. Visceral fat drains directly into the portal circulation, which leads straight to the liver. This close relationship with the liver makes it central to metabolic regulation. When fat is released from visceral stores, it is rapidly processed by the liver for energy production or ketone formation during fasting. Because of this direct metabolic pathway, the body can mobilize visceral fat efficiently once the hormonal environment permits. Research consistently shows that improvements in diet quality, structured fasting, and increased physical activity often lead to measurable reductions in waist circumference before dramatic changes appear elsewhere in the body. Waist reduction is frequently an indirect indicator of decreasing visceral fat. Many individuals notice that abdominal tightness decreases and bloating reduces relatively early in a well-structured metabolic program, even if total body weight does not drop dramatically at first. This is partly due to visceral fat reduction and partly due to improved insulin regulation and decreased inflammation. Inflammation is a defining feature of visceral fat. This fat depot secretes inflammatory cytokines that interfere with insulin signaling and promote metabolic dysfunction. When fasting lowers insulin and improves metabolic flexibility, inflammatory signaling tends to decline. As inflammation decreases, the body becomes more efficient at accessing stored energy. Because visceral fat is heavily involved in inflammatory processes, its reduction often produces noticeable improvements in metabolic markers such as fasting glucose, triglycerides, and liver enzymes before visible cosmetic changes become dramatic. It is important to clarify that a first to respond does not mean instant disappearance. The reduction of visceral fat still requires consistency and time. However, compared to stubborn subcutaneous fat in areas like the hips or thighs, visceral fat is generally more responsive to hormonal shifts. Subcutaneous fat is designed for long-term storage and insulation. It is less metabolically reactive. This is why individuals may experience improvements in metabolic health even before achieving the desired body shape. Exercise enhances this preferential reduction. Aerobic activity and resistance training both increase the body's demand for energy. When performed during or after fasting windows, exercise can amplify fatty acid oxidation. Because visceral fat releases fatty acids readily under low insulin conditions, it often contributes significantly to the energy supply during these periods. Over time, repeated cycles of fat mobilization and utilization reduces overall volume. Stress management also influences this process. Chronic stress elevates cortisol, a hormone associated with central fat accumulation. Visceral fat contains receptors that respond to cortisol, which partly explains why prolonged stress promotes abdominal fat gain. When stress levels are managed and fasting is structured properly, cortisol stabilizes. This further encourages visceral fat reduction while protecting muscle mass and overall hormonal balance. An additional advantage of visceral fat reduction is the rapid improvement in organ function. As this fat decreases, the liver experiences less fatty acid overload. Insulin sensitivity improves. Blood pressure may stabilize. These changes can occur even before large changes in total body weight are observed. This reinforces the idea that the primary goal is metabolic correction, not simply scale reduction. However, one must avoid the misconception that targeting visceral fat requires extreme measures. Prolonged starvation, severe caloric restriction, or excessive exercise can elevate stress hormones and potentially slow progress. The body responds best to consistent, moderate, and sustainable interventions that allow insulin to fall naturally and regularly. Structured fasting windows, balanced meals rich in whole foods, adequate sleep, and manageable physical activity form the foundation. Genetics also play a role. Some individuals are predisposed to store more visceral fat, while others accumulate more subcutaneous fat. Although genetic tendencies cannot be changed, hormonal regulation can significantly influence how these fat depots behave. Even those with a strong genetic predisposition can reduce visceral fat through disciplined metabolic strategies. Understanding that visceral fat is often the first to respond provides motivation grounded in biology. It means that internal health improvements may begin sooner than expected. The body is designed to prioritize survival and metabolic efficiency. When insulin falls, inflammation decreases and energy balance stabilizes, the most metabolically disruptive fat depot. Visceral fat is often addressed first. This reality shifts the focus from cosmetic impatience to internal progress. You may not immediately see dramatic physical transformation, but beneath the surface, important changes may already be occurring. Organs begin functioning more efficiently. Blood markers improve. Hormonal signaling stabilizes. And the very fat that posed the greatest metabolic risk begins to shrink. That is not a coincidence. It is the body responding intelligently when given the proper hormonal environment.